All right, so we've got some really intense material to dive into today.
Yeah, we do.
Our listeners have sent in a message from Apostle Joshua Selman,
Yeah.
and he's a Nigerian televangelist and Bible teacher.
Right.
Now, this message is called The Apostate Church.
Wow.
He shared it on his ministry's YouTube channel back in July.
I see.
So our aim here is to really get to the bottom of his, pretty direct criticisms of the church in Nigeria.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't hold back.
He really doesn't. And it's interesting because right from the get-go, he comes out swinging.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, he makes this really powerful statement right at the start.
Okay, what does he say?
He says, and I quote, "There is no place like the Church of Nigeria where we strengthen the hand of evildoers."
Wow. That's a strong statement.
It is, right?
Yeah.
And it immediately paints this picture, where the church is almost unintentionally supporting, bad things happening.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It sets a pretty serious tone for the whole message.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop there. He goes on to say that the church in Nigeria is in a dire strait, needing an emergency rescue.
Okay, so he's saying things are really bad.
That's the sense you get. It's not just like, hey, let's tweak a few things. This is like a 5-alarm fire in his view.
So it's a call to action, not just a suggestion.
Exactly. And then he gets even more specific. He starts outlining certain problems.
Okay, like what?
Well, the first big one is what he calls destructive leadership.
Ah, so he's saying that the leadership is part of the problem.
Yes, and he's very clear about it. He says, men and women of God in Nigeria who, rather than build the church, are destroying the church and scattering the sheep.
That's a huge accusation. It implies that some leaders are actually hurting the community they're supposed to be leading.
It does make you think what specific actions he might be referring to.
Yeah.
And this ties into his next point, which is doctrinal issues.
Okay, doctrinal issues.
Basically, problems with the teachings.
Exactly. He says, many doctrines from the pit of hell are being preached in our churches.
Wow, that's some pretty intense language. It is. And he even brings up things like the Laodicean church and the doctrine of Balaam, saying they're relevant even today.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with those, could you maybe give us a quick explanation?
Of course. So the Laodicean church, it's mentioned in the book of Revelation.
Okay.
And it's often seen as representing this spiritual lukewarmness.
Lukewarmness.
Yeah, like being neither fully committed to your faith nor totally against it, just kind of complacent and self-satisfied.
Ah, I see.
And then there's the doctrine of Balaam, which comes from the Old Testament.
Right.
And that one usually refers to this temptation of leading God's people astray, but for your own personal gain.
So like betraying your beliefs for money or something.
Exactly, like compromising your values for material reward. So when Selman uses these examples, it seems like he's suggesting that the Nigerian church is, maybe becoming a bit too comfortable spiritually and putting worldly success ahead of genuine faith.
It's interesting how that idea of becoming too comfortable spiritually seems to come up a lot in critiques of religion.
Yeah, it's almost like this constant tension between spiritual focus and material wealth.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it definitely seems to be playing a role in Selman's perspective here.
It does. And that leads him to this next criticism, which he calls superficial grace.
Superficial grace. What does that mean?
So he's talking about this idea of eternal security without responsibility.
Okay, so like once you're saved, nothing you do really matters.
That's the gist of it. Like, you're good to go no matter what you do after accepting salvation. He's not buying it.
Right.
In fact, he warns about a rude shock on the last day for those who think this way and just keep sinning.
That's pretty serious. So you're saying your actions still have consequences even after you've been saved?
Right. It's like this ongoing debate about how grace and human actions work together in salvation.
Right.
But Selman is definitely stressing the importance of continuing to live a life that reflects your beliefs.
Living out your faith, not just saying you believe.
Exactly. And then he moves on to the topic of prophecy, which is obviously huge in many Christian traditions.
Right.
And he talks about something he calls compromised prophecy.
Compromised prophecy. What does that mean?
Well, it's interesting because he acknowledges that God can give people the power to prophesy.
Right.
He says, God can give you the power to prophesy and things will happen. But then he immediately adds, God will hold you accountable on the last day for condoning sin.
So he's saying that just because someone can prophesy doesn't mean they're always doing it for the right reasons or that they're always right?
Exactly. And his concern is with these prophets who give good prophecies to people who are clearly living reckless lives.
So they're telling people what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear.
Right. And he suggests that maybe the motivation behind that is money, getting offerings from these people.
It's interesting how he links compromised prophecy to financial gain like that.
It's a connection you see quite often when you're talking about religious accountability.
I could see that.
And that takes us to his next point, which is financial corruption.
Oh, wow. That's a big one.
It is. He's directly accusing some people of being driven by greed.
How so?
Well, he says that some visions and prophecies are ignited by hunger in their belly. And he gives some pretty concrete examples, like blessing people who are living in sin as long as they give money.
Oh, wow.
Or the church becoming a place where people go looking for business deals.
So he's saying it's become more about money than faith.
Exactly. And he implies that this pursuit of money is making some leaders stay silent on important ethical and social issues because they're afraid of upsetting their donors.
You know, it's kind of a scary thought that financial pressures could affect any organization's integrity, even a religious one.
It is something to think about. And from there, he goes on to discuss what he sees as an erosion of values within the church.
Okay, erosion of values. What does he mean by that?
Well, he expresses this concern that everything about the church is now money.
Okay, so like materialism taking over.
Right. And he criticizes this desire for congregations that basically just want to be told how great they are. He wants congregations that are seeking God, not just ego-stroking.
Yeah, it's like the difference between wanting to grow spiritually versus just wanting to feel good about yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he contrasts this with his view that in the presence of God, there is the presence of joy, not the presence of foolishness. He's worried about what he sees as inappropriate laughter and a lack of genuine reverence.
So, like, people aren't taking their faith seriously enough.
That's the impression you get. He feels like the focus has shifted from a deep spiritual experience to something more shallow and entertainment-driven.
Right.
And he even gives the specific example of matchmaking in the church.
Matchmaking, like setting people up.
Yeah, and he says it's being done based on favoritism instead of spiritual guidance.
Oh, wow. So it's about who you know, not about finding a good spiritual match.
Exactly. And it might seem like a small thing, but it kind of illustrates this bigger point about worldly standards potentially overshadowing spiritual ones, even in something as sacred as matchmaking.
It raises questions about what values are truly driving the community.
Right. And this perceived lack of integrity extends to his next point, which is about the loss of integrity in the church's interactions with the wider world.
Okay, so he's talking about how the church interacts with society as a whole.
Exactly. And he says that you have politicians seeking the church for security, and you have prostitutes seeking pastors for prayers.
Okay.
But then he claims that some pastors are more concerned with their own personal gain than actually speaking the truth and leading these people towards Christ.
That's a pretty harsh judgment of those leaders.
It is. It suggests a real breakdown of trust and a failure to live up to the church's core mission.
So instead of being a source of guidance and redemption, it's become more transactional.
Exactly. And then he shifts his focus to something he calls the influence of New Age teachings.
New Age teachings. What exactly does he mean by that?
Well, he's accusing some leaders of being led astray by these teachings in the name of new creation reality. And he gives some pretty surprising examples, like people being told, you are the God of yourself, or they are Jesus.
Wow, that's pretty different from traditional Christianity.
It is. And he directly connects this to Satan's desire for self-exaltation.
So he sees these teachings as very dangerous and harmful.
Exactly. And just so we're all on the same page when he talks about New Age teachings, he's generally referring to beliefs and practices that differ from traditional Christian doctrine.
Okay, that's...
Things like emphasizing human potential to become divine, downplaying the unique role of Jesus, and focusing on self-power instead of God's authority.
So from a traditional Christian perspective, those teachings would be considered heretical.
Exactly, because they contradict core beliefs about God, humanity, and salvation through Jesus.
Yeah, that makes sense why he would react so strongly against them.
It does.
Yeah.
And linked to this is his criticism of what he sees as a dismissal of repentance.
Dismissal of repentance. So like people not taking responsibility for their sins.
Right. He's observing this trend of downplaying the need for genuine remorse and turning away from sin. And he describes this attitude of, no need feeling bad, just pull yourself up.
So it's like a self-help approach rather than a focus on divine forgiveness.
Exactly. And it kind of minimizes the seriousness of sin in his view.
Yeah, sure.
And then he gives this really shocking example to illustrate how far he thinks things have gone.
What's the example?
He says, the leader of the choir is sleeping with people and we are clapping for him.
Oh, wow. That's a very disturbing image.
It is. And it really drives home the severity of the issues he's highlighting.
It's like the community has become so desensitized to sin that they're celebrating it.
Right. And it goes back to his earlier statement about strengthening the hand of evildoers.
Yeah, I see the connection.
Finally, he addresses this emphasis on shortcuts over process in seeking God.
Shortcuts over process. What does he mean by that?
He's talking about this focus on immediate breakthrough and quick fixes.
Okay, like what kinds of shortcuts?
Things like touching an anointed person or paying prophets to pray for you.
So instead of a gradual spiritual journey, it's all about instant gratification.
Exactly. And he
Yeah.
contrasts this with the proper process of faith and spiritual growth, which takes time and effort.
Right.
He even uses this relatable example of somebody in 200 level in the university who wants to buy a Jeep to show how unrealistic these expectations can be.
It's like they're skipping steps and expecting miracles without putting in the work.
Exactly. And he ends this point with a really important distinction. He says there is a straight line between faith and foolishness.
So he's not saying faith is bad, but he's warning against a kind of faith that's not grounded in wisdom and discernment.
Right. It's faith without understanding God's ways.
Yeah, and without the personal growth and character development that should come with it.
Exactly. So
Right.
when we look at his message as a whole, Selman's critique boils down to a few main points.
Okay, what are they?
He sees a big drift within the Nigerian church away from basic biblical principles.
All right.
He's really worried about the influence of materialism and worldly values, which he thinks is leading to compromised leadership and a lack of accountability for sin within the church.
So he's basically saying the church has lost its way.
That's a good summary of his perspective. It's a very strong and passionate assessment of what he believes is a spiritual crisis.
And for our listeners, it's important to remember that this is just one viewpoint within a very diverse and complex religious landscape.
Absolutely. We've gone deep into Apostle Selman's message today.
We have.
And it really makes you think,
About what?
what happens when a religious institution's practices and priorities stray too far from its core teachings and ethics?
That's a good question.
What are the consequences? And what does this tell us about the need for self-reflection and accountability in any community or organization, not just religious ones? It's definitely something to keep in mind. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has.